And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to all of you Connie Rao. She is the president of Friendship Heights Neighbors Network.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone who is a village member and a non-village member, and a special welcome to all FHNN and Little Falls Village members. FHNN and Little Falls collaborate on programs, and I want to recognize Margaret Walker, the LFW Marketing and Operations Director, if she's there. If not, you will see her coming in and out. I want to mention something that I think you already know, which is one of the reasons that we thought this program was so appropriate, is that February is Black History Month. And this is an opportunity for all of us to become better educated about one of the most important figures of that history today. Villages are always happy to have new members and volunteers. And I want to encourage you to join your area village, if you've not already, to support the services provided to seniors in programs like the ones we're having today. Now it's my special pleasure to thank the National Park Service, and especially our speaker today, Kevin Bryant. You will be amazed at his background. Kevin is the lead park ranger at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, D.C. He has worked for the National Park Service for 8 years, spending the last 6 immersed in the life and times of Frederick Douglass. A native of Illinois, Kevin holds 1 master's degree in American history, another in religion, and a certificate in diversity and inclusion studies. He is the author of the park's Language of Enslavement document, encouraging thoughtful reconsideration of traditionally used language surrounding the system of enslavement. I now turn the program over to Kevin.
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm very happy to be joining everyone. As we go through this presentation, there will be opportunity for questions, but I ask you to just hold on to those until after the presentation, and then we can have some opportunity to share or put things into the chat and probe a little bit deeper into the life and times of Frederick Douglass, this man who I am so incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to devote my life to studying. There's no replacement for being inside of historic buildings and being in the places where history happened. One of the perks for many of us being local is we have that opportunity. Maybe not at this specific moment. And so I want to virtually open up these doors and explore through Frederick Douglass's final home with you. This is the home for the last 18 years of his life. And in kind of my hot take to launch us off here, I am of the opinion that in the entire history of the United States of America, there is no single person more significant to that story than Frederick Douglass. I think he is the most important American to have ever existed in shaping not only the nation as it was, but the nation as it is, and the nation hopefully as it will be yet in the future. So this is his home in the southeast section of Washington, D.C. We are in the Anacostia neighborhood. Frederick Douglass lives these final 18 years. He moves in 1877. It is a 21-room house. It has 6,000 square feet of space inside, had 15 acres that are connected with it. Clearly, Mr. Douglass is doing well by this point. He did not build the home, he bought it. It was already here, one previous owner before him. But the home itself is impressive enough. But also from his front porch that we see pictured here, if we were to spin around 180 degrees, we get an amazing view of the District of Columbia, where many key buildings and prominent locations and landmarks are all within view. This picture does not even do full justice to how broadly expansive that view from the district is. Frederick Douglass, now in the final 18 years of his life, a Washingtonian, is overlooking the entire national capital from a hill that is one of the highest hills in the District of Columbia. This home that he called Cedar Hill, named for the cedar trees that were covering this gorgeous hill where his home now sits. And although the view is impressive enough, let's take a moment and walk inside of the home virtually. When you go in the front door, this is our entryway. There's a center hallway, Going down deeper into the main level of the home, there's a staircase that takes us up to the second floor. Both of those directions we will explore in time. But more importantly, when we entered the home, we'd be greeted by a staff member, and there are two parlors on your right side and on your left side. And who you are determines which one of these parlors you go into. If you're a family member, if you are a friend, a close ally or confidant of Mr. Douglas, you'll go into the parlor to your right. If you're someone like most of us who may be interested in him, may not know him on a personal level, however, we're going to go into the parlor on our left. And that is this room. This is called the formal parlor. As we look in the formal parlor, not just this room, but every room and every picture that we will see, one of the amazingly powerful details about Frederick Douglass's home today is the items that you see in this photograph. And in every photograph I will be showing you, these are the actual items that belonged to Frederick Douglass. This is the real stuff, the real furniture, the real statues, the real music boxes and mirrors and images and kerosene lamps. This is not just period things like what they might have had. This is the exact stuff. In this room, again, is a space for journalists, for politicians, for business people, for admirers. Frederick Douglass has shown up here in 1877. And when we hear about Mr. Douglass today, when we watch documentaries about him or when we hear about him in various classes or lectures, we hear about the important work that he has done both before and after his time period in this home. But the one thing that we don't hear nearly as much about, in 1877, when Frederick Douglass moves into this house at the age of 59, he is quite possibly the most famous human being on the planet at that moment in time. Frederick Douglass is the most photographed human being to have ever lived in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass is one of the top 5 world travelers of the 19th century. He is everywhere on this planet, it seems, during his time. Frederick Douglass writes 3 autobiographies about himself. Each one of them become an international sensation and bestseller. You could buy them in multiple languages all over the world during his lifetime. Mr. Douglass is an advisor to 8 different presidential administrations. He is in the White House for 33 years, in every administration from Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s to Benjamin Harrison in the 1890s. That's a long history. And for 54 years of this man's life, he is standing on stages all across this planet where audiences of thousands are coming to hear him day after day after day. Frederick Douglass is a global sensation in his time, not just an American civil rights leader, though he is. He is one of the earliest human beings to begin adopting the phrase human rights and recognize the global struggle for justice is so much bigger than even as important as America's battle for justice is. So in this room, with that framework in mind, these are the people who admire him, who want to meet him, who are hoping to interview him, students doing reports on him. That is our conversations in this parlor. It is the public side of Frederick Douglass. But Frederick Douglass moves in. Again, he's about 59 years of age when he shows up. He does not know that, however. At no point ever in his life does Mr. Douglass have any clue how old he is. He spent the first 20 years of his life in this inhuman system of slavery, and among the things stolen from him by that system was a knowledge of his age. He spends his life guessing. We know things today about him that he never knew about himself. We know he's 59. He didn't know that, however. He lives in this home from age 59 to age 77. For dates, that's 1877 to 1895. That is the time period of this home. And in that time period, Mr. Douglass is married. He has now adult children. I want to draw your attention to the framed picture that's between the windows inside of this image. It's a small little image back there, but this is an amazing woman. And I want to give you a closer look at an actual photograph of her. This is the same woman that was pictured in that image. Her name is Anna Murray. And simply put, without Anna Murray, not a single one of us probably would have ever heard of Frederick Douglass. Frederick, as I mentioned, 20 years in slavery. Anna never sees a moment of slavery in her life. She's born in Maryland, but she's born as a free woman. Life is still hard for her, but it's fundamentally different. One of the differences between she and Frederick that their legal status carries out, when Anna works, she gets to keep money from that effort, even if it is nowhere near the amount of money that she deserves based on the labor that she is putting into it. It's significant head start over Frederick, who's forced to work for others and keep nothing. Anna, by 1838, is working in Baltimore, working cleaning some homes, doing laundry, binding shoes up there. But yet by 1838 as well, Frederick is now enslaved in Baltimore. These two circles have overlapped. Frederick, an enslaved young man about 20 years old. Anna, a free, hardworking Black woman, saving money, though not nearly as much as she deserves. And on September 3rd, 1838, Anna Murray Douglass alters human history for all time because she uses her resources that she has saved and she funds Frederick's escape attempt. This is what makes everything we know him to do in the future possible. Her bravery, her courage, her heroism, her willingness to break an unjust law, to give this one man a better chance. She did not know what you and I know. We can turn the page in a history book and see exactly what Frederick Douglass will do in coming years. She doesn't know that. She simply can look at her environment and see one young man near her who is caught in injustice. And she knows she has the tools to do something about it. So she will risk her safety. She will risk her security. She will risk her freedom and her life to break the law for this young man who turns in to the Frederick Douglass that we will meet in history. Days after he completes his escape in 1838, Anna finds him in New York City and they get married. They push further north together. They have 2 daughters and 3 sons. And 40 years later, they move into the home that we are talking about. Most of Anna and Frederick's life together happened in other places, Massachusetts and New York. Only the final 4 out of 44 years of marriage unfold in this specific home, where tragically, Anna will pass away much earlier than Frederick does. He lives 18 years in the house. She only lives 4. And after Anna Murray Douglass, the hero of our story, after she has passed away, Frederick, in time, will make a very controversial decision, and he is going to remarry. This is the woman he remarries. Her name is Helen Pitts. And it can be hard to tell in some of these old black and white photographs sometimes, but Helen is a white woman. This is probably the most famous interracial marriage in American history, when Frederick Douglass marries Helen Pitts from upstate New York. There's no shortage of opinions from the public on this, almost all of them universally hating this idea, no matter who you are. Interracial marriage at the time was a state-by-state thing. There's no federal jurisdiction or no federal standard law for it. So the marriage was legal in the District of Columbia where it unfolded. That does not mean it was popular. Frederick and Helen are married for 11 years. Frederick and Anna before that were married for 44 years. Frederick and Anna had 5 children. Frederick and Helen have 0 children. So if you ever encounter news stories or events with descendants of the Douglass family there, as there are many, they are all descendants of Anna's line. None of them are descendants of Helen's line, as she has no children separate from him either. These are the 2 key people who lived in the home at different times with Frederick Douglass. Anna at first, and then later, Helen, which takes us up to Mr. Douglass's death. She will survive him by several years. So Anna and Helen with adult children visiting. This is Frederick Douglass here. Again, during our time period, a very unique portrait painting of him, capturing his majestic hair and the beard, kind of that iconic things as we think about Frederick Douglass in his pictures. But aside from the look that he's carrying, I want to draw your attention to what is in his hands when you see the full portrait here. In Mr. Douglass's hands is the baton of justice for the United States of America in 1877. which is that critical date for our purposes here. 1877 is when he moves into this house. That same year, Frederick Douglass has been appointed by President Rutherford B. Hayes to be the United States Marshal for the District of Columbia. He is in charge now of the DC police force. He's in charge of the DC jails. Mr. Douglass oversees the court system. And Mr. Douglass is also responsible for escorting around the US president to major social events and gatherings. He is on the platforms during the inaugurations. It is a very high profile position with very real law enforcement authority. That is America's baton of justice that is depicted in his hands here. That's his arrival, continuing not just to be someone who fights to reform the government, but someone who is inside of the government. This is now Marshal Frederick Douglass. And a kind of a fun fact about this, Frederick Douglass is the only United States Marshal in American history to have ever been formally hunted by other United States Marshals who once traversed this globe trying to find him because of the work he was doing in earlier years to try to dismantle America's political tapestry, to remake it in a way that actually worked for everybody. Now he is the boss of some of those people who desperately tried to find him in years past. An amazing journey that we are uncovering as we move throughout this space. We are still in that same formal parlor for visitors. You can see the entryway that we enter to our right side, but we're going to walk straight ahead here through the doorway at the center of the photo, take us into Mr. Douglass's study. A beautiful space. You can see some of his books over there on your right side, portraits around us on the walls. Some of them, no doubt we recognize immediately, even at a distance. Some others that are not as recognizable to us, but these are his allies. These are the people Frederick Douglass is working with, men and women alike. Great views of canes and artifacts and desks. Again, this is the real stuff that we are seeing here. When you look at his chair, you notice the seal of the United States still on the back there, denoting his official governmental work. On this desk is where he writes some of the most famous words he will ever write. He pens them with those pens that are still in front of you on the desk, pulling ink out of those inkwells. His formal top hat over here to the left, his more casual hat to the right side, and we have priceless images of the home, of him working in these spaces. You can still see the same images on the wall above him as he's seated here. You can still see even, some of the statues over his left shoulder in this historic image of Frederick Douglass, same ones that are still here in this modern view. This is the real stuff that we are looking at. And it is priceless that we have access to these images, that we can bring him back into the space and look at his beautiful library collection there. These amazing volumes, all of which we still preserve in the National Park Service, but not all of which are in the room at the moment. We rotate them in and out of this space. As we see these treasures, they include his sunglasses, original volumes of his newspaper that he had held on to that he's archiving, and this book collection. Again, he had 1,000 volumes in this library during his life. We still have all 1,000, but we rotate them in and out for security, for safety, and for preservation purposes. Frederick Douglass first got the clues to how to read or write when he was about 8 years old. He'd been sent to a new family up in Baltimore, the Auld family, A-U-L-D. Sophia Auld, who Frederick is now living with, she never enslaved a human being before. So she didn't understand some of the expectations to white America of what you would or would not do with these young people who you are enslaving. Most importantly, among the things that she did not understand was that it was generally accepted white people should not be teaching the enslaved how to read and write. An 8-year-old Frederick approaches her one day, is curious to learn his letters. And maybe to a little bit of Sophia's credit, she recognizes a child thirsting for knowledge here and begins to teach him the alphabet. She doesn't get to teach him the whole thing, but she gets some basics in him when her husband shows up. And he sees her teaching Frederick this fundamental aspect of letters. And he throws a temper tantrum, screaming at her, screaming at Frederick, just loses control of himself. And as Frederick reflects back on that moment, he will say, that was the first anti-slavery lecture I ever heard. I now understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was learning to read. In his young mind, The message has been cemented. What is so dangerous to white Americans about the idea of educated and learned Black Americans? What is dangerous to them about that? He doesn't want me to read, therefore, there is something in power in those words. Frederick, now in secret, will commit to learning everything he can from that point forward, including the rest of the alphabet, phonics. How do you piece these sounds together? How do you make words? How do you learn to write? By the age of 13, operating on the streets of Baltimore secretly, Frederick Douglass is fully literate. And he is now running his own underground secret schools, trying to educate the enslaved among him. Frederick Douglass does not wait till he escapes slavery to figure out how to destroy slavery. He's trying to destroy it while he is still actively caught up in it, before he's even figured out how to get out. And though he'll get out at the age of 20 with Anna's help, he will never, ever stop learning, even to this time period. He is reading everything he can get his hands on about every subject. These books are a powerful witness to his life's work and what he's carrying out for us. Moving across the hall, you can see that main doorway in the right corner of the screen, that entryway from the porch. This is the other parlor that we would come into. They would not use the words living room, but that's basically what this parlor is. This is a space for family and friends to come inside of. When we think about Frederick Douglass in this room, as we see this statue of him, in this room, put aside the famous stuff. Because when he is in here, we are talking about a husband to Anna and later to Helen. We are talking about a father to 2 daughters and 3 sons. We are talking about a grandfather now to 21 grandchildren. This is a vibrant space of family. And in this vibrant space of family, the people who are here are going to say, most often what Mr. Douglass does, he's crawling around the floor on all 4s. He's just playing with the grandkids, making these priceless family moments as best as you are able to, because he, in his journey, has no clue who his grandfather ever might have even been, let alone have any memories of him. And now, at this period in life, he is the grandfather. Frederick wasn't allowed to have a family growing up. America ripped it apart from him by its endorsement and support of the legal system. So he doesn't have these connections growing up. And you can't make up for lost time. We all know that, but you can do the best you have and commit to making the most out of the time available to you, whether that's one conversation in one moment, or whether that's a series of years or multiple generations. We can commit to be our best selves and treasuring those moments. That's what Frederick's trying to do here. He is pained by what he didn't get in his past, but he also recognizes, I need to make these moments happen, not just for my soul, but for theirs. Moving forward, this is family and friends inside of this space. We are surrounded by artwork and musical instruments, but we are also surrounded by reminders of his past. He has curtains to give privacy throughout the space from time to time. And instead of just wrapping ropes or cords around him, we have balls and chains hooked around each of these very visceral reminders of his past and what is at stake. Something that for many people, we would think you wouldn't want these reminders around you. Frederick has them everywhere. He knows what is at stake in America. These very sorts of things once were used to try to confine his body and limit his movements. He is not just looking for physical liberation. It is intellectual, it is political, it is theological liberation, and all of this and much more that he is not just looking for himself, but battling for tens of millions of people around the globe who are looking to him to be leading them forward. More artwork and statues, amazing pieces, a piano that he'd love to be accompanied with. His violin is still sitting on that piano. Often they would come through this doorway with the family in order to relax in that room, but they're coming through that doorway out of the dining room, have a meal there, and then move through the door to relax with family and friends inside of that parlor. In this dining room, the table could expand and have big formal dinners. It's set up now for a fairly small, intimate gathering. And looking at items in a photograph like this, I think you can still see it, but it's not always as evident as being in person. But when you look at the chairs around the table, there are 5 chairs around this table. The one on the right is significantly larger than the other 4, taller and wider, because Frederick Douglass was taller and wider than most folks who are coming to be in this space with him. Mr. Douglas is 6'2". He is 235 pounds, and he weightlifts almost every single morning of his life. He is a very strong, a very large man. I'm not trying to portray him as a giant, but for most of us, if we are in a social setting, if we are in a room and a muscular person at 6'2" walks into that room, they're going to tend to be one of the larger people in those settings we find ourselves. Think about the reason that Frederick Douglass is weightlifting still here into his 60s and his 70s. He is not weightlifting because it's a responsible choice. He's not doing it for healthy living or longevity or to look good or anything like that. It has those side effects. You know, it is good for him in general. Frederick Douglass is weightlifting to keep himself alive. The level of fame that he has around this planet means millions of people love and admire and adore him. That also, unfortunately, means millions of people hate him with every fiber of their being. And often, Mr. Douglass knows, as you know, we encounter in later generations too, there's a lot of hate. Often hate is just kept to words, whether spoken or written down or typed. Majority of the time, it's just words, ignorant and dangerous and painful as they may be. But they're not always kept to just words. Frederick Douglass is violently attacked in public more times than he can count throughout his life. It keeps happening over and over and over. He has to be able to defend himself when these moments occur. That's one of the reasons why he is weightlifting. The ability to fight off any amount of attackers who might be coming at him. He cannot retire or relax. His work is too important. Even here again, from age 59 to age 77, you have to be ready any moment to get in a brawl, maybe on a stage, maybe even while you're just minding your business in your own home, when that hate-filled violence and ignorance finds you. Frederick Douglass does not know what the end of his journey is going to be. He's pretty convinced, though, the end of his journey will probably be violent. It's just a question of when, where, and by whose hand. And as we see throughout other pages of not just American history, but broader world history, not every human rights warrior lives to see old age. Many of them are taken from our global community at much younger ages violently. Frederick suspects he's probably going to die violently. Fortunately for our awareness, he does not. But again, he does not know that he's going to be very blessed to have a peaceful passing at his home. We'll explore that a little bit later and see some of the environment around that last day. But the dining room here and the entryways, visitors would not go beyond these spaces very much. I'm going to show you just a couple of the items here, some of their china collection, a table. An important thing that I want to be very clear on, even though we all deep down understand this, it's important to speak the things that we take for granted sometimes. As we explore through Mr. Douglass's home, we are not just exploring the home of another wealthy family from the late 1800s, kind of making a difference and having some impact in American history. We are doing that, yes, but there's so much deeper level to that. When Frederick Douglass was born in February of 1818, in the eyes of the official political structure of the United States of America, he was no different than anything in these pictures right now. He was not a human being in the eyes of this nation. It was a thing. He was a piece of property that is ignorant and wrong as all get out. And hopefully we all fully understand and acknowledge that. But that was his origin, with these twisted people around him trying to dismiss his humanity and say that you are just something that is here to profit someone else, to be used. So that journey is the one that we are on. Not just how do I make it in America? How do I pay the bills? How do I provide for a family? Those are important battles too. But his first battle, I am a human being. And everything starts with that battle, which goes on for decades for him, of asserting that most fundamental humanity. Not that he needed to be convinced, he knew it all along. But too many other ignorant people around him refused to recognize the clues that were in front of their face from the beginning. These are people and deserve every ounce of civil, political, and human rights as anyone who has ever or will ever live. The items, the original items in the home remind us a little bit of those painful origins for them. We've moved into the back of the home here. This is a laundry room, a wash room. Brick floors are here because there's just going to be water everywhere. It's fancy technology for their time, though maybe not as much for ours, but for their time, they would have a pump in this room. Water is going to flow straight out here. So it's not indoor plumbing, but it's getting closer and closer to that world that's familiar for many of us. Visitors would not be making their way back here, though it's an important room in the house. Given the choice, I think every one of us, if we had a choice between putting on a clean item of clothing and a dirty item of clothing, we'd probably opt for the clean item the vast majority of the time if we had that ability to access those things. But for Frederick Douglass, this takes on a little bit deeper meaning than just the benefit of having clean clothes. While he is traveling, giving these paid public speeches, this is where most of the income comes from his life, is traveling around. But while he is gone, in this room or in previous rooms and other homes before this like it, Anna, daughters, staff members, supporters will be laundering his clothes, drying them, starching them, ironing them, and packaging them to mail and reach him in advance of his speaking destinations, no matter where he is on this planet. There is a whole community of individuals preparing his laundry and mailing them all over the world. This is some next level complicated logistics. I think this would be hard for many of us to pull off today with, overnight air shipping and things if we're willing to pay enough for it. They don't have any of that technology in order to make it happen. And this community that supports him and makes him have the ability to stand on the stage proudly and boldly and pristine. There are so many people that are operating in that circle, allowing him to get the spotlights. Frederick Douglass knows this is a required aspect of the work, not for vanity, not just because you want to look good, but because the position that he has been thrust into, he hates this responsibility, but he knows it's what history has put upon him. He has to look perfect every moment of every day because millions of Black Americans are being unfairly judged based on him and how he carries himself in public. So every time he comes off that train and stands on a stage, he must have a perfectly pressed suit. He cannot have a wrinkle. He cannot have a stain. He cannot have a bad hair day because his predominantly white audiences over the years listening to him, not all of them are hostile, but many of them are looking for any reason to dismiss what he's saying, any reason to justify the things in their mind that they likely already want to justify, that he's not someone that we really need to take seriously. And even if it's as simple as a stain on his clothing, that look, see, he doesn't really take this carefully. If it's some hair being out of place on his head, he really doesn't even care. He's just coming out here to say some things. Can't even bother to fix his beard or his hair in these moments. This is so unfairly thrust upon him, but he knows it is unfortunately the reality of that moment. He can never truly relax, even in his home, even with his family. He can never truly relax because journalists will be knocking on the door constantly, and they don't all want to do supportive journalistic articles about you. Some of them are trying to catch you, trying to trap you. And you got to be ready any moment of any day for that next public engagement. Because if you don't have it perfect, his fear and what American history demonstrates, that might therefore impact the most fundamental citizenship or broader civil and political rights of millions of other Americans who, again, are being unfairly judged based on Frederick Douglass, who is hands down the most famous Black American of his time. He is the one that white Americans are seeing and hearing the internal thoughts from for 54 years. That is a heavy responsibility to be carrying. So laundry through those eyes takes on some very different meaning. This is the last room on the first floor. Through a doorway in the back is the pantry where food is going to be stored. This is our kitchen. This is another room as we look around that can be very familiar to us. We have many of these same items likely in our kitchens to this day, a reminder that we are not that far removed in time. But this is another room that at second glance has a deeper meaning for Frederick. His wife, Anna, cannot quite understand the deeper meaning this has for him. His children cannot quite understand the deeper meaning that this carries for him. Frederick Douglass is super uncomfortable having conversations about food, which is really weird for us nowadays to think about, because food is often something that we use to bring each other together. We share plates. If you have issues with somebody says, let's go get a meal together and kind of talk this over. Frederick Douglass doesn't like conversations about food, and think about his past for the clue as to why. When he is 6 years old, Frederick is sent to a forced labor camp on Maryland's Eastern Shore, ripped apart from the last known family connection that he had at that age of 6. This place is called the Y House. At the Y House, a 6-year-old Frederick is fed out of a pig trough. 3 spoonfuls of corn are thrown in once per day for all of the children. That's not just for him. That's for all of the children. There's never enough to go around, not even close to being enough to go around. Frederick tells us when he writes his memories later that he survived by wrestling with dogs to steal their food when his enslavers aren't looking. He describes pulling bones out of the mouths of cats sometimes and just chomping on the bones whole. Frederick is by himself in these years, and he is doing these things at an age when, for you and I, he should be in first grade right now. He is on his own, and all of this is fully legal. But the memories that he carries from this moment for him connect back to the feeling of hunger. There was never enough food to go around for anyone. He describes being constantly hungry. And even though that was a long time ago, again, that specific moment, age of 6. He escapes from slavery, age of 20. He moves into this house, age of 59. That's a long time. But you don't forget that stuff. You can never forget those memories, those feelings of trauma, those emotions deep down of who you were forced into becoming there. And even though he is not lacking for anything by this time period, he clearly has some money. There's clearly food galore that is an option to him. The simple, normal human feeling of hunger that every single one of us experiences, that feeling of hunger for him is painful. Not so much in a physical sense, but in a psychological sense. It brings back those very vulnerable memories of a 6-year-old simply trying to survive, where all he sees around him is starvation, is punishments, is hatred, is blood, and is death. That's why he's fighting so hard. This is his lived experience. This is his childhood. Death and evil and blood and starvation, all of which legal in the United States. And so much of it as well, complicit by millions of others who may have said it was wrong once upon a time, but if you didn't actually actively take any steps about doing anything about it, you would say you're just as complicit as those holding the whips. Silence is a dangerous tool to stop battles for justice. Those who may say it's wrong, but do nothing about it. Frederick says it's just as bad as doing it themselves. His fear, not that America has done this, but that America might do this again in the future. He says, we have shown what we as a nation are capable of by destroying millions of lives across generations. The fear, what if we go back there at some point in the future? It might look a little different when it comes back, but he's really worried about that. That is why he is fighting a global struggle for justice and human recognition. Because if we don't fight it, if we don't agitate, if we don't stir it up, things might begin to shift back in that painful direction. The snake, as he will call slavery, the snake might just change its skin. Same snake, but it might look different when it returns. This is among his fears. We've gone through the whole first floor, and I want to kind of wrap us up with the last couple rooms on the second floor, which is a boarding space. In this second floor, we'll see a room like this full of his suitcases or his trunks. You can still make out his name on this trunk that's sitting there. He will travel the world. We've mentioned that a couple times, this global figure. But when he's traveling the world, he is leaving the family behind. That stuff takes a personal toll, not just on him, but think of Anna at these moments. Think of the children in these moments. Think of now the next generation, grandchildren growing up, and you have a super famous grandfather, but he's gone all the time. And how hard these conversations must be for everybody. The conversations that we have had with ourselves, no doubt many times for every single one of us here. How do I do the things that matter to me? How do I do the things that bring value and that sense of wholeness in my life. But then how am I also with the people who bring value and meaning into my life? And where is this balance between these two things? And what does that look like to find meaning for myself and to find meaning through them and with them? And just because you might find your balance doesn't mean everybody in your circle likes the balance that you pick. That is our tension with Frederick here. He is undeniably doing the right things, but that doesn't make it easy when we remember a family dynamic at play. Every time he gets himself famous in the history book comes at the price of Anna and what she's having to hold together back here behind. Children growing and again, grandchildren growing. It's important work, but these are human beings just like us with all the same family dynamics. When family members come to visit Frederick and Anna, this is one of the rooms that many of them will be staying in. It is a women's guest bedroom here with a beautiful blue and white striped wallpaper. There are two main guest bedrooms here. This one, which is intended for women, whether relatives, whether friends, or whether other folks coming to stay with them across the time. Across from the women's guest bedroom is a second guest bedroom intended for men to be in. Again, sometimes friends, sometimes folks he doesn't know well, sometimes family members. Two guest bedrooms on this second floor that would house tons of visitors, family and friends alike. This takes us to the end of the hallway, looking out the front of the home again from the second floor, this big picture window where our final three rooms are located. One room on our right side, two rooms on our left side. This is the first of the rooms on our left side, a private bedroom for Anna Murray. This is his first wife. You can see through the doorway off Anna's room, going into that women's guest bedroom with the blue and white striped wallpaper there, two separate rooms, guest bedroom and Anna's room. Anna only lived in this home, again, 4 years out of the 44-year marriage. Most of her life was in other places. On the walls in Anna's room is two of their adult sons, that is Lewis and Charles, two gentlemen who will serve together in the Civil War in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, amongst much other heroism that they and other children will engage in. These two now adult children are visiting in this space as their mother passes away. On August 4th of 1882, in this room, Anna Murray Douglas will pass away from complications as a result of having a series of strokes in recent weeks. This is the woman now departing us who made everything we are talking about possible. Because of how titanic her legacy is and how critically important she is in the story, even if history has not always spotlighted her the way she deserves to be and rightfully should be, the family knew how important she was. This bedroom that we are seeing was sealed off after her death. It becomes a memorial to either to your spouse in Frederick's case, to your mother in the children's case. No one sleeps in Anna Murray's bedroom from that moment forward after her passing. So knowing what you and I know, Frederick Douglass in time will remarry. His second wife, Helen, needs her own space, which is what we're looking into now. This is that second wife. It is the room immediately next to now Anna's shrine, the room to our left. Won't spend too much time dwelling on this here, but a quick glimpse in this room. Notice the technology, the implements that are around there. Compare it with what we saw in Anna's room, where we don't have so many of those same things. It gives you little glimpses into the different experiences of these two women in America. Anna, again, that freeborn Black woman laboring on Maryland's Eastern Shore, working hard, dedicated, devoted, just simply to survive. Helen, a white woman from upstate New York, coming from a comparatively wealthy family, college education. Things she has much easier access to some items that Anna desperately thirsted for and yearned for and worked for as well. But Helen has a whole bunch of technology and things to help her do that out. These women on the surface, very different, but in their hearts, very similar. They are both activists in their own right, even prior to their involvement with Frederick. Don't just think of them as a spouse, as a plus one, as a wife behind the scenes. These are each amazing human beings, even if Frederick Douglass was never involved in either of their stories. And that takes us to our final room here. Across the hall from Anna and Helen's room is Frederick Douglass's bedroom. This is his private space. And it was very customary at the time for those who had wealth to do so, to keep spouses in separate bedrooms. So don't read anything into that as you think of relationship dynamics between Frederick and Anna or later Frederick and Helen. In the bedroom, just a few items I want to zoom in on and take a closer look. In the middle there, that long piece of wood is a boot jack. When you got these long boots, you're going to pop your heel inside of it. They can be really hard to pull off by yourself. So by putting your heel in there, it helps him pry off that boot by himself if he doesn't have somebody else to assist him. We have many of his items of clothing and shoes. These are just one of his sets of original shoes here. They are very comparable to a modern men's 11 in terms of size. And I mentioned his weightlifting. You see two of his smaller weights that are just sitting here laying on the floor. Solid blocks of iron. Each one of these specific ones that we are seeing is 12 pounds. In Frederick Douglass's bedroom, as we've done a quick journey through the home, I want to wrap us up with a final threads here. Out back of the main home is this stone building. It is called the Growlery. In this growlery, which is fundamentally like his man cave that he goes to get away from everything, this is where he does a lot of reading and writing and thinking. This is a personal escape for Mr. Douglass. There are no windows on this. He would just walk through that front door, close the door behind him, and any curious visitors, admirers, etc., they wouldn't know if he was in there or not. It's just a space he could be by himself in a cabin eerily similar to the cabin he was born into in slavery in Maryland in 1818. There's a lot of meaning in that, a lot more meaning than any of us today will ever fully be able to understand or appreciate. That a building that once echoed oppression and pain for him is now his private psychological escape to go into for political liberation in this sense. We're back in the front yard, taking that look upon the home. And I want to end you with one final story before we open up the floor for some conversations here and questions as folks may have them. The last day of Frederick Douglass's life was February 20th, 1895. He's 77 years old at that point in time, and he spends all day long gone from the house. He is at the location in Washington, D.C., where the FBI's headquarters sits today. There's a different building there at the time. He is with Susan B. Anthony, and he spends 8 hours fighting for women's rights at that intersection. He comes home at the end of all of it, goes back on the front porch here, goes in that front door, sits down, has dinner with his second wife, Helen, and is then leaving the home after dinner to go back outside to do some more activism when he suffers a massive heart attack. He collapses in the entryway of his home as he's attempting to walk out those doors, and with Helen holding him, his second wife, minutes before 7 p.m., February 20th, 1895, the man of millions of words has now passed away, quite literally trying to go outside and do one more thing than the 54 years of one more things he'd already been doing over and over and over. He did not die violently, as he thought he might, but he did die in the middle of his work, leaving that final lesson for all future activists and ancestors, descendants rather, to build upon, that even Frederick Douglass never retired. Though violence did not end him, the only thing that could finally stop him was when his body just couldn't be pushed any further. At this moment in time, I will stop sharing my screen for us because I want to open up the floor. I hope we have some questions or curious thoughts here as I've been chatting a bit.
Yes, hi. We do have some questions in the chat, and there are a lot of thank yous in the chat as well. And the one question is, did he play that violin on the desk? There's a piano too.
Correct. So he does not play the piano, but he does play the violin. He is a self-taught violinist. Teaches himself in 3 days how to play the violin.
In 3 days? That's amazing.
He's 27 years old. He's in Liverpool when he buys his first violin. He doesn't know how to play it, sees a violin for sale in a store, looks like a challenge. He loves challenges, especially ones that push his brain and his mind. Goes into it, buys a violin, takes it back to his room. His entourage traveling with him says no one saw him for 3 days. 3 days later, he emerged violin in hand and announced he was hosting a violin concert that night.
Oh my gosh.
He is one of the authentic human geniuses to have ever lived.
We've got many thank yous. This one talks about you. It says, this was a terrific presentation. I learned so much. Ranger Brian is wonderful. He's a gem, the best I've ever heard. I'm 80 years old. And a thank you for us for making this presentation public. So we've got a lot of wonderful, wonderful thank yous. Here's a question. What surprised you in your passionate research?
One of the things that surprised me is how profoundly not only significant Frederick Douglass is, but how underrepresented the community of allies who make his life possible was. American history often can get simplified to significant men at key moments doing things with other significant men. And we all know there's way more to the story than just a bunch of key men doing things. They are able to do some of these things because of the others around them. And the biggest surprise for me is how critically significant Anna Murray Douglas is in every aspect of this story. Without her, we don't know who he ever could have become. She rolled the dice with no guarantees of the future. That just demonstrates so much of what we don't even fully understand about her, where her heart was to take that risk in the first place.
That's a great answer. Thank you. In addition to his autobiographies, did he write other books?
He does, yes. So Mr. Douglas writes 3 autobiographies in his life, but he also writes a novel at one point. It's called The Heroic Slave. So 4 total books that he will pen, 1 novel and 3 autobiographies.
Okay, thank you. Question about how to get a copy of the recording, and we'll make that available. It'll probably take a few days. It won't be immediate. So send an email either to Little Falls Village or to FHNN, whoever you registered through. Many thank yous. This I think you answered, but just to remind people, how old was he when he died, and was his age at passing average at that time?
Oh, great series of questions there. Yeah, so he is 77 when he passes away, which would mean something very different in his time period than how we would hear that figure today. He is significantly beyond his life expectancy. Life expectancy for a white man at that time is fundamentally different than life expectancy for a black man. And life expectancy for a formerly enslaved black man is even lower than for a freeborn black man. He is 23 years beyond his life expectancy. So it is a significantly older age than how we hear that figure today in its youthfulness.
And I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about how this house was preserved with all of his personal items in it? I mean, it's amazing.
It takes us back to that idea of following off of like Anna's heroism and making this whole story possible. When Mr. Douglas dies in 1895, Helen, his second wife, survives him. She lives 8 more years, and in her final 8 years, from 1895 till 1903, that is her priority, preserving the home and the artifacts and the items. If Anna lets us know who Frederick was, Helen lets us see his stuff and be in his house today. She begins the journey of preservation, works with Congress to get federal funding. This is before the National Park Service existed. Get federal funding for an organization that will preserve the home. When she dies in 1903, she wills the home to that organization. They run the home as a private museum from 1903 till 1962. This group is called the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association, and they partner with another powerful organization, the National Association of Colored Women. Those groups together survive the home till 1962, when they reach out to the federal government, ask the government to get involved at that point for some stable federal funding into perpetuity. So it's been a national park since 1962. But well existing and operating with visitors since 1896.
Okay, so here's a question. Really, compared to other, this I'm adding a little bit, compared to other famous Americans, we really don't know as much about Frederick Douglass as we know about other Americans. And the question is, why do you personally consider him to be the most important figure in American history?
Yes. I think there is absolutely no thread of America that you could throw at me that I couldn't find some way to connect it to Frederick Douglass. And a piece of that, a simplified version of this, is going into that idea of the home being preserved. When the home is preserved immediately afterwards, nowadays for us, that makes sense. We all know about historic home museums. Those are things, we have them all over our communities. County historical societies run them. In 1895, that was not a thing. It's believed this home is only the second historic house museum to ever open to the public in American history. Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, being the first. So with this statement then being made, that's a profoundly prophetic statement by opening the home, saying, no matter what we might think about George Washington, we can all understand that if we're telling a simplified version of America, it kind of makes sense. If you have one guy, he would be at the center focus of it. And now what is being announced in this moment is you have the president, who some would say kind of created the nation, if we're simplifying things. And then we have the man who rose out of that to fight all of the presidents who failed to create the nation properly. and grow to challenge all of them and that legacy. So you have George Washington and you have Frederick Douglass placed side by side at that moment. And that's his life's mission. Everything they created was intended, but failed in the proper execution of it. He is, I think, rightfully to be placed as a new generation of founding father trying desperately to get America to do it right. We talked the beautiful words, we wrote them down. They're all in those documents, but there didn't really seem to be the moral or the political will amongst enough people to carry it out amongst everything. His threads are everywhere. You still find his words resonating in every governmental body to this very day. He's actually up for the Congressional Medal of Honor right now. They're debating that.
Oh, wouldn't think it'd be a very long debate, but
it could be. We've had many senators and representatives and things visiting with us in the home over recent weeks as they're working through this process. Again, his value to the world community still priceless.
And here's a question about your background. This person might have logged in late. Maybe you could just give us a couple sentences again to remind us about your background.
Sure. So I've worked for the National Park Service total for 8 years. I've been at this current position for 6 years, and I have no interest in going anywhere else because of how important I feel Frederick Douglass is in getting this narrative better understood. On a personal level, I have 2 different master's degrees in both religion as well as in American history, and graduate certificates in diversity and inclusion studies that I've gone to try to broaden my worldview and expand and tell the story as ably as I'm able to.
Thank you. Here's a question. What is the significance of the tropical frieze between walls and the ceiling of the main rooms?
That is a great observation, a great catch. And there's this one thing when it kind of pops when you're in the space. It's another in images like this to pull that out. Yeah, there is key significance in that nothing in the home is an accident. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appoints Frederick Douglass to be ambassador to the Republic of Haiti. That idea going along the top is designed to remind us of Haiti, which from Frederick Douglass's perspective is the most important nation in the world in terms of lessons for America because of how they handled the overthrow of the system of slavery. And they didn't try to legislate, give a bunch of rights to the formerly enslaved. They said, just get out of the way and let those people govern and lead the country and vote and become presidents and prime ministers, et cetera. A post-Civil War America, Frederick Douglass knows there is nothing we should be studying more as Americans than the history of the Haitian Republic. America opts not to go in that direction, though. They're convinced we can handle it better by a bunch of white folks voting to give rights at different times to other people. And we see the after effects that come from not listening to that message.
Thank you. Here's a question. Did Mr. Douglass have a favorite child, which is in quotes?
A favorite child? Ooh. If he did not confide that.
Okay.
As people may say they do or do not. I think one that really resonates most with him, I don't know that I would use the term favorite in this, but it's going to be his youngest daughter. Her name was Annie. And part of the reason I say this is the only occasion where out of the 168 photographs of Frederick Douglass, the only picture we have of him with one of his children is with Annie. It's a beautiful little photo of that. But also Annie is going to die days before her 11th birthday.
Oh.
And that profoundly influences the remainder of his life, the loss of who he calls his baby girl there. And that is a reason why he's not buried in Washington, D.C. Even though he passes away in the home, he requested very clearly he wanted to be buried in Rochester, New York, because all his Washington, D.C. years, Annie died in Rochester. And as a dad, I don't think he likes the idea of his daughter laying in a cemetery by herself with no other family up there. Dad's going to go be laid by his daughter. And so he and Annie are together with their mother, Anna, as well, up in Rochester, New York.
Here's another question about the home. How many acres is the property? Who built it originally and in what year?
It's originally constructed by a man named John Van Hook, started in 1855, is completed in 1859. So it's about a 20-year-old home when Frederick Douglass will buy it. Frederick purchases at its total, the home, 21 rooms and 15 acres of land. Today, we still have the home. We do not have all of the acreage. We have about 10 of the, just a shade under 10 of the 15 acres. So a small portion of it was lost in the 1950s to an apartment complex.
Thank you. How old was Helen when she married Mr. Douglass?
She is 46 years old when they get married. There's a 20-year age gap between Frederick and Helen, which is one of the many things that made that remarriage controversial. It wasn't just that it was an interracial marriage. You have an age gap at play too.
Thank you. The photos of him are very interesting with a tone of dignity. Was it typical for people not to smile when taking formal photos at the time?
Yeah, another really good question. Yes, so that's something that became kind of Frederick Douglass's trademark, but it was very common at the time period due to the exposure, the length of time you had to kind of hold still for the photograph to settle. It would be hard to maintain, or harder to maintain a smile without slight little changes. So you just try to keep a neutral face for the most part going forward. It's not just Frederick Douglass doing this.
Thank you. Do we know anything about his parents or any of his family?
He never has any idea who his dad might have been. He has no clue. The closest he will give us is he will say, it was sometimes whispered that my master was my father. He's convinced that whoever his father was a white man, but he's also very strongly convinced that he's a product of a non-consensual relationship that occurred there, which sadly is fairly common in its evil amongst the system of slavery. So he never knows who his dad is, though he suspects it's the enslaver. He does know his mom very briefly. Her name is Harriet Bailey. They are separated very early on. He describes her saying, I never saw my mother more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and never under the light of the sun. So he knows very little about her. And she's passed away at least by the time he's 7 years old. She's already passed, but they'd been separated long before that. So a handful of spotty memories that he has of her.
Thank you. You mentioned Douglass being a federal marshal. What other official positions did he have?
Yes. So he serves as a federal marshal under President Rutherford B. Hayes administration. In Ulysses Grant's administration, he's a diplomat and co-commissioner to Santo Domingo. Under James Garfield and Chester Arthur's administration, he is the recorder of deeds. Also, I guess I should mention, in Ulysses Grant's administration, he is also on the territorial board for the District of Columbia, the precursor to what today we would know as the DC City Council. And under Benjamin Harrison's administration into the 1880s and 90s, he serves as an ambassador to Haiti. Each of those other presidents during the times, he didn't have official paid roles inside of, but he's serving as an advisor to Lincoln, to Johnson, a few others scattered in there, Garfield as well.
Thank you. What do we know about his descendants and their lives?
Yes, many descendants that are still with us to this day. And again, all descendants come through Anna's line, none of them through Helen. The closest living relative to him today is a great-great-granddaughter. She's with us. She's fine. She's doing fantastic. So her grandfather was in this house with his grandfather, who was Frederick Douglass. She has many children and grandchildren herself. So the majority of the Douglasses that exist today are 3rd or 4th greats going down the line. And as with many families, they've kind of scattered across the nation. The biggest single concentration of Douglasses today is in Southern California, though a few are here inside the DC area. There's 3 currently living in the district as far as those aware.
Thank you. Here's an interesting question about DNA testing, revealing more information about Mr. Douglass's father, including whether or not he was white. I don't.
Yes. Yeah. So the family, I shouldn't say they have, if the modern generations of descendants have done DNA testing, it has been their choice not to share that information publicly, which is their right to do so with the family.
Sure.
So I suspect they have done some of that, but that's not something that they are comfortable sharing on the record. And even if that goes in, that may point us in several key directions, but I still don't know that that would give us much specifics other than giving us to a family line, which among the theories that there's some pretty compelling evidence if Frederick's kind of the man who gave the biological material to that created him, if that was not the enslaver, there's pretty compelling reason to believe it could also be one of the siblings of that individual. So it put us within kind of the same genetic family line, if that even proved it. But I don't know that even DNA could firmly reveal that for us in the current understanding of DNA.
Thank you. Questions are still pouring in. One question was, is the home a field trip destination for schools and other groups?
Yes, it is. When we are open, we love to have field trips and school groups and senior groups and church groups and family reunions and all sorts of folks coming and going. We have multiple tour times throughout the day, but 3 of those tour times are specifically set aside for that very purpose, for these larger groups to be able to come in and allow everyone the opportunity to get what they want from it.
And I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about his impact on the women's suffrage movement?
Yes. Frederick Douglass is at the very first major American women's suffrage convention held in Seneca Falls, New York in July of 1848. It's put together by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Not only is Frederick Douglass there, as are many other men, he is the only man not the only black man, the only man willing to stand up and publicly put himself on the record calling for that motion for full suffrage and equality. He fights for women's rights for 50 years, almost 50 years, stemming from that moment. And that Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848, that's 13 years before the Civil War even busts out. So it's not that he's moving from cause to cause to cause. And these are all that overlapping global struggle. In those variations of his efforts and involvements through the women's rights struggle, though, sometimes he is fighting with these prominent women's rights leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and sometimes he is fighting them as they make some choice. They don't always make some great choices in the efforts to make it clear. Anthony and Stanton especially reveal themselves in time after the Civil War to not truly be as interested in women's rights as they are in white women's rights. And that's an area where there's some friction. Douglass says, I will unite with anyone to do right and with no one to do wrong. So imperfect as their cause may be, he's still going to work for it. But he's also going to work with other women's organizations pushing for all women's equality. So it's a tense relation. They're not always friends, but they're not enemies by any stretch either. But again, that final day of his life, he's working with Susan B. Anthony again, working on the cause of women's rights.
Thank you. Did he talk about the impact on him personally and on his work of having a white unidentified biological father due to non-consensual relationships? Was that maybe in some of his books?
Yeah, he references it a couple times in his writings, but he doesn't dwell on it too much. The main time that he will speak on that is going to be on some platforms. And it's essentially when he wants to shut somebody up who's coming for him, trying to cut him off in a debate. And he will use that, then what he believes his white parentage, to dismiss these arguments that he is a subhuman based on his African or Caribbean descent. He will say, you are insulting me saying that I'm not a human being. And yet in that nature, if you accept what the product of slavery is, you are insulting whiteness in that moment too. So he selectively uses it to try to help himself in some arguments.
Thank you. Here's another question. How did he get his name?
Oh, yeah. Good question. I didn't mention that. Frederick Douglass is not the name that he is born under. When he is born, the name his mother would have known him as for that short time is Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. That's who Anna knows. That's who Anna helps bust out of slavery. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. When they complete their escape and they get married, they need to change their names because all these folks looking for them, Fugitive Slave Act, things like that are in the ether, even if not the one we think of a little bit later in 1850, he can be hunted and he could be re-enslaved is his fear. So if he continues going by that long name, Frederick Bailey, that's who they're going to start looking for. So Frederick and Anna decide to change their name and they're going to be Frederick and Anna Stanley. That gets them through New York and they're going to go up to Massachusetts. They become Frederick and Anna Johnson, where they meet with a man whose last name is Johnson and they discover there's a lot of Johnsons up there. So they need a name that'll blend in a little bit better. Frederick goes to a friend that he has made up there, this Underground Railroad connection that got him to New Bedford, Massachusetts, named Nathan Johnson. And he says, pick out our new name. I want you to have a choice. But the only thing he says, do not take Frederick from me, because that is the only thing I have from my mother is that first name. I must preserve that at all hazards. This man, Nathan Johnson, had been reading The Lady of the Lake by Sir Walter Scott, where there's a human rights warrior whose name is Douglass. And he suggests this might be a fitting name for you, given what I think you might be capable of doing in the future. Frederick loves it, but personalizes it, takes the name Douglass and slaps a second S on it. And from that point forward, he's Frederick Douglass, even as he's later is outed for his real identity in life. He keeps Douglass. So sometimes amongst those descendants today, some of them use the last name Douglass. Others have gone back and used the last name Bailey, honoring that original last name and the broader aspects. So you have Baileys and Douglasses and Bailey Douglasses and everything in between.
Okay, thank you very much. How much did he look backwards versus looking forward to create change?
He tries to look forward the vast majority of the time. He will say, in reference to looking backward, we have only to do with the past as we can make it useful to changing the present and the future. So that history is a tool not just to be studied because it's interesting, but it's a tool to help us understand our imperfections nowadays and how previous generations battled with those imperfections. So he looks back a little bit, he studies back intensely, but for the broader purpose of pushing a vision forward.
And I think this will be the final question, and then maybe we can open it up. Did Mr. Douglass have anything to do with Clara Barton?
He does. He corresponds quite a bit with her. And I mentioned in some of his governmental positions that he is the recorder of deeds for a period in the 1880s. Frederick Douglass's signature is on the founding documents of the American Red Cross. Among other things, he's the one helping with that incorporation of things that are launching it. So he knows her very, very well.
And now if we could stop the recording and take people off mute, that might